All right, so here we are. Here is the journey through Bordeaux. It's not just 3 seminars. It is a lifetime for sure. So I don't want people to feel like they're going to get shortchanged here. But seminar 1, which we had, that was the Taste of Bordeaux: flavors, grapes, and overview of the region. What are we talking about? Why are we talking about it? What's the significance of this area? Tonight, seminar 2, the legacy of Bordeaux. This is about the grape varieties and the terroir. We're digging back, 250 million years. Certainly not everything happened 250 million years ago. A lot of it is more recent history in the last 1,000 years or so. But it really is important to see what shaped Bordeaux. Why is the region today the way it is? Why are grape varietals as important as they are? And why are certain grape varietals only maybe 1, 2, 3% of a given wine's blend, if even used at all anymore? And then seminar 3, which is upcoming, is going to be about the regions of Bordeaux. So we're going to talk more about the communes, talk about more of the local terroir. Why is Saint Emilion different from Pomerol? Why is Saint Estèphe different from Saint Julien? Why is Haute-Brion different from Margaux? And we'll taste wines from all those regions as well. So something to pay attention to. A little bit about myself. Why am I standing here in front of you? I am standing here because I was invited by the Commandery de Bordeaux to become a part of what is really Eric Vogt, who's, what's your new title, sir? It's Grand Maître. His vision for education is inspiring, and he wants not just people to appreciate Bordeaux, but to speak more intelligently about it. Because with confidence and with knowing about a region, you can really start to, one, not just inspire passion in other people, but two, you can start to appreciate the wines and the region and the people on a different level. So I'm here. My name is Michael Marr. I'm one of 249 master sommeliers in the world. I live in the Boston area and did my undergraduate degree at Harvard University. My degree is in sociology, so what that meant is no matter what, I was going to have to go to some sort of grad school because there was no real job trajectory for a sociology major. So I decided to go to culinary school directly out of Harvard. So I went to the Culinary Institute of America, trained to be a chef for a couple of years. Came back to Boston, worked in a couple of, in my opinion, top-end kitchens. Decided that cooking wasn't quite the lifestyle I wanted to be a part of. I have all the respect for chefs in the world. It wasn't suiting me. So I moved to Australia for a year, got a master's degree at the University of Adelaide, came back and went into restaurants once again, but more in the front of the house. Became a sommelier, became a beverage manager, worked with some top wine programs here in Boston, and all the while was studying, being part of competitions, and eventually all my studies, all my work led to my achievement as one of the 249 master sommeliers in the world. So I love wine. I'm passionate about wine. The only thing I'm probably more passionate about than wine is education of wine. So I hope you all find some tidbits here tonight that you can take home. I want you all to have questions. I want you all to not just stare at the screen and be overwhelmed by it, because we're covering a tremendous amount of history here. We're covering a tremendous amount of information. It wasn't compiled by me in 20 minutes. I'll be totally honest. This took days and days and days, and more digging and emails with Eric and going back and forth. And we emailed many chateaus in France. What's your history? There's a lot to go through here. So don't be intimidated by it. Please don't. It's worthwhile. And even if you just get one thing out of tonight, come back to the information, come back and review it again and again and again. And that's how you learn. That's how you build these flavor memories. That's how you build these profiles. That's how you build your database of knowledge in the world of wine. And just don't forget to taste wine as you're doing it. We have wines for you to taste tonight, so you will not be shortchanged in that regard. So that being said, let's get started. So here we are in France, in the Hexagon, and as we mentioned in lecture number 1, Bordeaux, just down here right on the Atlantic Ocean, about the size of half of Rhode Island, for those of you who are familiar with our little itty-bitty state here in New England. So imagine half of Rhode Island is covered with vineyards, and that's what we have here in Bordeaux. But geologically, we want to talk more about the Aquitaine Basin, and the Parisian Basin, and then the Massif Central. Since we are focusing more on geology tonight, these are the most important, basically, formations that we're going to be dealing with. So the Aquitaine Basin, obviously named after the Aquitaine, the Parisian Basin further up north. Massif Central, a huge plateau that encompasses most of the central part here of France. And these will all play a significant role, despite them being so far away, into the geology of Bordeaux. So again, as we talked about, we're going to be talking about geology that's occurred over, basically, most importantly, 2.5 million years ago to today. Really a drop in the bucket of the geological history of planet Earth. Earth has been around for 6 billion years, give or take 500 million years or so. So when you think about that, 2.5 million years ago, it's really almost an instant in the history of the Earth. And even that being said, only the last 20 to 25,000 years has really given us the soil structure of what Bordeaux is today. So again, this is recent history. This is like it almost happened overnight in the history of the world. So we're talking about some relatively young soil structures. And we're going to compare some Australian soils that are 2 to 3 billion years old, some really old dirt there. This is fresh, this is new, this is really still being developed, even as we speak, even though it doesn't seem like it. So again, the Libournais and the Medoc created during the Quaternary period, and then we get down to the substrata, the limestone. We talked about the Parisian Basin, we talked about the Aquitaine Basin. You get this limestone only through marine deposits. It's not really found anywhere else except places on the Earth that were underwater at some point. So these soils were actually created during the Mesozoic and Cenozoic areas about 250 million years ago. So we have this really, really recent topsoil, and then you get down to some limestone that was created 250 million years ago. And then eventually these oceans that were in place here 250 million years ago have receded, left behind this marine deposit, which fossilized, gives you these limestone deposits. So again, some really fascinating, interesting stuff that gets you out of the gate here. You're really wetting your palate so we can dig in a little bit further to some more specific soils and terroirs in Bordeaux. So the geological history in the Medoc, we talk about our left bank and our right bank. If we're facing downstream, and we're facing the Atlantic Ocean, the left bank will be on our left and the right bank on our right, the Libournais and the Medoc. So the gravel deposits that we find mainly on the left bank, these are going to be coming from the Pyrenees. And you think, well, these are mountains. These are up at high elevation. How do you get all this gravel from way up high, especially when you don't have gravel down at the lower elevations? How do you get it down from high elevation, 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 feet above sea level, all the way down to essentially sea level? It's during the Ice Age. You have these gravel deposits that were ground up during the glaciation period. So you have these giant deposits of gravel that get ground down by ice, and it's crushed and then sent down the mountains. And you have this very turbulent, fast-moving river system coming out of the Pyrenees with this basically essential flow downhill of gravel. And you have what is the Garonne, which means literally stony river. So you have these stones being deposited all throughout the riverbed. And essentially what happens is, as time marches on, all these deposits of stone, essentially when the river turns to the right, you get these deposits on the left. So this is why most of these gravelly deposits fall right up here on the left bank of Bordeaux, because this is where you see most of the right turns. So you see most of those gravelly deposits being deposited there. So we go to the right bank, we go to the Libournais. This is coming from a totally different part of the world. So we talked a little bit about the Massif Central at the beginning. So now we move inland. This is more volcanic history. This is a little bit more older history. We move back a couple million years before all this gravel deposit taking place in the Pyrenees, and we have volcanoes. We have a lot more iron. We have a lot more, basically particles which will be ground down over time, again by glaciers, just by deposits of wind, into finer particles which are more easily transmitted by water. So what we have here is a bit of a more gentle river system, starting up at, again, higher altitude, somewhere around 1,500 meters above sea level, about 4,500 feet, 5,000 feet, so a little bit lower than the Pyrenees down here. And it's a much gentler decline. So what happens is you don't have this kinetic energy which is able to take these large boulders and stones and things like that down the river system. What you do have is a lazy, comparatively speaking, a lazy little river that can take fine particles, things like sand and silt and clay particles, and then deposit them down at these lower elevations. So over time, you're going to have these deposits building up, and this is why we have most of the clay being deposited on the right bank, because we have the Dordogne River, which starts up here in the Pyrenees from two little, I guess you could call it little baby rivers, if you will. You have the Dor and the Dogne. So you put those together into the Dordogne. And also to kind of further illustrate the sourcing of all these materials, the little village of Le Mont Doré is where most, basically this is where the river system starts. This is where most of the particles are coming from in that area here in the Massif Central. So talked a bit about gravel. So now that we have our systems set up here and we see gravel, we see a lot of this soil structure being set, we want to talk about something that's very important on the left bank, and this is the gravel mounds. And we think about gravel mounds as being, the way it sounds, a little, maybe a couple feet high, a couple feet wide, something you'd find maybe in someone's backyard after a dump truck deposits some landscaping materials. But no, these gravel mounds that you'll find, especially in Pauillac, especially the Latour vineyards here, Saint Estèphe. These gravel mounds extend for miles and miles, 3, 4, 5 miles at a time, and can actually run fairly deep, can run 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 meters deep into the soil. So you have these enormous gravel deposits, again, being set up over tens of thousands of years, mostly in the last 20,000 years. And this is why these vineyards are so special, because gravel, pick up some gravel when you're out in the garden, and it drains. It doesn't retain water at all. So what you have is essentially an opportunity for water to fall here, and instead of draining down, collecting and draining down, right down into the river system, this water can actually go right straight through the gravel into the aquifer system. So you can get some really deep water sources for these vines to basically crack through that gravel and find some water even in the driest of vintages. So you have a really unique structure here you won't find anywhere else in the world, and that's this really deep deposit system of gravel. We jump across the river. We talk a little bit about this clay and limestone, and you talk about these soils that were deposited by fine particulates. And this is why we talk about Saint-Emilion and Pauillac slightly differently than we do on the left bank. So what we see here is the village of Saint-Emilion, right in the heart. Up at top here, we have a lot of clay and what's known as calcareous soil. So you have clay mixed with a little bit of that limestone. So it's, again, fairly unique to have this really fine pulverized soil structure, which allows some drainage, but also retains water. It's this perfect balance of being porous like a sponge, but also retaining just enough water so these vines can dig in. The further down the further down this plateau of limestone you get into a little bit denser soils, you get into a little bit more clay-based soils, and then you get down to really right along the river here, and you get more alluvial soils. Generally speaking, you're going to have your best vineyards up at the top and on the plateau because you're not getting as much water retention down here in the denser soil structures right along the riverbed where you have a little bit more kind of dampness, moistness, where vines can be susceptible to rot. Up here you get a little bit better drainage, you get a little bit more freshness and minerality, especially here in Saint-Emilion, from these soil structures, from limestone. Moving over to Pomerol, you'll see, again, a lot of limestone. You'll see a lot of limestone and clay. It kind of, again, erodes downhill towards the river. But up here, there's this nice little, what they call a button. And this is actually where Chateau Petrus, and why Chateau Petrus is so famous, because you have this button of blue clay. Really the only place in the world that you will find this really unique blue clay. That came, again, from the Massif Central and was deposited in a very, very brief amount of time. Just a very different soil structure here. So Petrus is based only on this blue clay. You have some other producers certainly that have access to blue clay in their vineyards, but Petrus is the only one that has an entire property based upon this little button of clay. And then you move down, you get into, some more sandstone, some more limestone, and then you get down into more, again, kind of lesser appellations. Moving outside of Pomerol, you get into a little bit more, rustic and more approachable wines, certainly in their youth. But again, you can see how the complexity of soil over tens of thousands and tens of millions of years took place, and how you have these little eccentricities of soil structure. So right now in front of you, you have two glasses. And before you taste them, I want you to just take a second, because there's something very important I have to say. These are not wine. These are both grape juice. So when you taste it and you smell it, and you'll be like, what is this? This is not proper wine. Realize I put down in front of you two different wines, or soon to be wines if they completed their fermentation, but two different glasses of grape juice because, well, why? We talked about different soil structures. So we want to also talk about different grape varietals. However, once you start getting too many variables in the glass, you have different soils and different grape varietals, it's really hard to tell, well, where does soil end, where does grape begin? So what we've done is we've taken just the basic elements here of Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot, put them down in front of you for you to taste. That way you can see, what does pure Merlot taste like? What does pure Cabernet Sauvignon taste like without oak, without really a lot of terroir? These are a little bit more commercially farmed, so it is more about that kind of purity of grape varietal rather than transparency of terroir. So does everybody feel good about that? Okay, I'm getting a couple of nods out there. It's like, yeah, this is a little strange, but we're good with this. Fantastic. So take a taste of those, and as you start tasting those, we're going to move on a little bit to some genealogy and history of grape varietals here. Because now that we've talked about, again, 250 million years, we want to talk about a little bit more recent history, if you will. A little bit more history that involves mankind and the cultivation of the vine. So we're starting our history of Bordeaux grape varietals with Cabernet Franc. And a lot of people are already giving me a look and going, well, why is Cabernet Franc the first varietal we're talking about? Everyone kind of has an idea that this is not the most important grape. This is a grape that's maybe one or two producers that use significant amounts of it, but mostly it's a blending grape. Mostly it's something that people will use in accessory to something like Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot. But this is actually one of the most ancient grapes in the entirety of the Bordeaux region. And a lot of history says it's likely to come from the Basque region, so just over the Pyrenees Mountains into the northern part of Spain there, a coastal region. So it's very well suited to a maritime climate. It's an early ripener. It's a late, basically a late flower and early ripener. So it's used to having kind of extreme temperatures both in the wintertime and then kind of a quick growing season and then extreme winter coming again. Deals with a lot of humidity well as well. So this crosses into the Pyrenees from the Atlantic, whether it came over the mountains or it came by boat around the mountains. It also came up the Atlantic into Brittany and the Loire Valley, which is why you'll see Cabernet Franc not just here in a maritime climate in Bordeaux, but you'll also see it in the Loire Valley, in Chinon, in Bourgogne, a little bit further inland, more continental climate. This was a very popular and important center of commerce in and around Bordeaux, the northern coast of Spain, Bordeaux, and up to the Loire River. So we'll start with Cabernet Franc. Came into existence mainly into Bordeaux around the 8th century. So again, it's hard to try to really pinpoint when certain grape varietals came into play because written history can be a little bit, certainly they didn't have the internet back then. They didn't have this, the vetting of information like we do now. So it was a lot about just written word. And when someone discovered something, they wrote it down. And someone else might have discovered it years later, but the first record was destroyed. So again, everything doesn't always line up the way we like it to, all nice and neat. But around the 8th century, give or take, is when Cabernet Franc came into play. So we're going to move into a different grape varietal now. And so we're going to start with Cabernet Franc, as we mentioned, the most important grape varietal and one of the most ancient grape varietals in Bordeaux. So you see Cabernet Franc on our genealogical chart here, and we're going to cross Cabernet Franc with Gros Cabernet. Crossing a grape varietal. What does that mean? Well, essentially, grapes are kind of like people. You get them to basically combine genetic components, and they can produce offspring. And every time that happens, it'll produce an offspring that's different than the time before. So each of the children of the grapes is going to be just as individual as your children at home, as your brothers and sisters. Certainly you have some similarities, and you might be able to easily observe those similarities, but there are also going to be drastic differences, different hair color, different personalities, different height, different weight, different styles. All these things are going to appear just like they do in people, but also in grape varietals. So we have Cabernet Franc and a grape varietal called Gros Cabernet, and we have them to be crossed to produce Carmenère. Like, well, Carmenère, I didn't expect that to be number 2 on our list of historical grape varietals. Mainly today it's been, I don't want to say relegated to Chile. It's not used as much, certainly, in Bordeaux anymore. It's found more favor in the New World over in Chile and in South America. But it is important because Carmenère was there in the early days, around the 11th, 12th century. Carmenère really came into full effect, and it provides, again, more tannin. It provides a little bit more color to your wine, certainly an herbaceous quality to it that you can pick up from Cabernet Franc. But we also have Cabernet Franc up here being crossed with an unknown grape. This is a really interesting thing about Carmenère. It's not just a child of Cabernet Franc, but as we see on the right-hand side, Cabernet Franc crossed with a grape that got lost through time to produce something called Hondarribia Beltza, which is a very important grape varietal in Basque Country even today. So we see, again, Cabernet Franc having its importance in the area. Hondarribia Beltza is now crossed with a grape called Fer Servadou. A bit of an esoteric grape varietal. You do see it in certain parts of southwestern France, mainly into, again, Pyrenees region. But these two grapes got crossed, and they actually are the parents of Gros Cabernet, which then is the parent of Carmenère. So not just the descendant directly of Cabernet Franc, but also the child, grandchild, great-grandchild of Cabernet Franc. So it's a bit of an incestuous relationship here. But in the world of grape varietals, it's not a big deal. It's not going to produce a grape varietal with any sort of genetic defects. It could, but in Carmenère, it didn't. It produced something that's actually fairly stable and durable. So, everyone all right with that? I know it's a lot of information that we're covering, but we want to make sure that everyone feels good about it. So if you have questions, do please write them down. We'll try to make sure they all get answered by the end of the evening. So now we start back up again with Cabernet Franc. Again, you can't get really anywhere in Bordeaux without having Cabernet Franc as one of your launching points. So Cabernet Franc, and we're going to cross it this time with a grape called Magnolia Noir de Charente. And this is a grape varietal. If you've had a lovely beverage called Pinot de Charente, you know it is in the Aquitaine region. But this is a grape varietal. It's a little bit more kind of juicy and plump and round, and it's not produced much anymore. It's more, again, kind of lost to history. There are a couple plantings of it out there right now, but you won't see much wine made from Magnolia Noir. So Cabernet Franc crossed with Magnolia Noir, we get Merlot, a grape varietal, absolutely, that is incredibly important today in Bordeaux. It is the most widely planted grape varietal in Bordeaux. And now we see actually, 14th, 15th century, we're again stepping forward a couple of years. Now we see a grape varietal that's really kind of stuck with it in terms of its importance. And Merlot was created, again, crossed between Cabernet and Magdalen. And it was actually named after the black bird you see down to your right. And it was named after this bird because the bird loved it. Merlau was the spelling of this bird's name, and it was in the vineyards, and you could really tell where Merlot was planted because the birds would flock to these vineyards. They would just be all over it, and you'd realize at that point it's probably time to go harvest, or else the birds are going to take everything back in, and we're not going to have anything left. And people really liked this wine. They liked it because it was soft, it was juicier, it provided a little bit more ripe fruit. And if you've had Cabernet Franc before, you know it's a little bit more kind of green and herbal and tannic, a lot more savory elements. So this was a perfect foil for Cabernet Franc in blending. So you can see why this was so important, why it caught on so quickly, because it was durable, it didn't mind the humidity of the Atlantic Ocean, and it provided really consistent, reliable wines. It ripens a little bit later than Cabernet Franc, which most of the time isn't that big of a deal. But certainly in your really cool wet vintages, Cabernet Franc can play a bigger role and Merlot can take a little bit of a backseat. But now we have a grape varietal that ripens a little bit later. So when we do have warm vintages, now we're getting grapes that really produce something a little bit more special, a little bit more kind of round and textured, and with a little bit more softer, more velvety tannins than you would get out of something like Cabernet Franc. So Petit Verdot, this is always a grape varietal that it's probably been one of the most controversial grape varietals in terms of parentage over the past 30 years since DNA testing has come into play. But Petit Verdot is always thought to be a family member of your quote Bordeaux varietals, your Cabernet Francs, your Merlots, your Cabernet Sauvignons. But now, most recent DNA testing says it's actually a domesticated wild vine from the Pyrenees. It doesn't have any sort of genetic, it has some genetic similarities, but not enough to actually put it into the Bordeaux family, or what they call the Carmenet family. So it's, again, kind of these strange things, one of these strange things that's popped up because it's perfect for everything else that's in the region. And it's kind of a chicken or the egg. Was Petit Verdot used in Bordeaux because it works with everything else, or did everything else kind of work with it because now we started to understand how Petit Verdot was used and they used it in small increments, and it didn't really ripen every single vintage, so it was something that just kind of existed, and now we don't really know the history of how Petit Verdot came into really full online production within Bordeaux. And that being said, it's spicy, it's full-bodied, it's big in tannins. It has to be tempered very much in the glass, because you will very rarely see a 100% Petit Verdot wine coming out of anywhere. And when you do, it needs years of age, or it needs a big, huge steak to go with it, because it's such a beast of a wine. So when you do see Petit Verdot used in Bordeaux, it's going to be 1%, 2%, 3% of a blend. And even then, it's going to be most likely in your warmer vintages, because this ripens a little on the later side. So if it's a cool, wet vintage, you're not going to see Petit Verdot taking much of a precedent, or certainly much more than it usually does. Again, 4 or 5%. You might see it scale back to 1 or 2% because of crop thinning and because of a lot of restrictions in the vineyard. So we start now with one of the parents of Merlot. One of the few times we're not going to start with Cabernet Franc. We're going to start with the Magnolia Noir de Charente grape. So again, something that's a little bit plump and a little bit silky and a little bit soft and velvety, a little bit more elegant, if you will, rather than kind of herbal and aggressive. And we're going to cross it now with a grape called Prunellard. Prunellard you'll see, again, in kind of the Pyrenees area. It's not really a stand-up grape varietal on its own, mainly used for blending, often used for distillation or some sort of aromatized beverage. But we're going to cross these two grapes and come up with, again, something incredibly familiar to probably all of us in the room, just by the sheer volume that we see in the market today, and that's Malbec. Again, Malbec plays a small role in Bordeaux. It is more of an accessory varietal. It's not the shining star at any property, but it does add some flavor. It does add some color. It does add some texture. It can often boost up a little bit of the alcohol, if you will, because sometimes you just need a little bit more oomph in the wine to deal with a lot of, to make it a little bit more age-worthy, to make it more of a vin de garde as opposed to a vin de boire. So we have Malbec, big, fat, plump grapes. Again, very much representative of Magnolia Noir, and you can see why it's the half-sibling of Merlot. This is one of those genetic similarities where you can really see, Merlot and Malbec have a lot of similarities. You put down a glass of Merlot and a glass of Malbec. It's tough to, you can get there, but it's one of the more difficult grape pairings to actually say this is definitively one or the other. Malbec doesn't quite take to oak as well as Merlot does. So if you are finding yourself in a conundrum, is this Merlot or Malbec? Merlot does much better with oak. Merlot also has a little bit firmer tannins. And Malbec tends to be a little bit more kind of light, does a couple of 2 or 3 things on it, personality-wise, really, really well. And that's about it. Whereas Merlot, again, just has a little bit more depth. And this was created around the region of Cahors, which isn't far from Bordeaux, but certainly, 500, 600, 700 years ago, it might as well have been the opposite side of the planet. That kind of travel wasn't done in a couple of hours. It was done over a couple of days, if not a couple of weeks. Everyone was pretty regionalized back then. So this grape varietal still exists around Cahors. Malbec is the grape varietal that you must rely upon in Cahors. So a bit of a relic of the past, but at the same time, this is the way the world was. It was very much regionalized. People didn't move around a lot. So, what would be Bordeaux without talking about Pinot Noir? Yeah, I know, again, everyone's looking at me again, strange. Yeah, but yes, Pinot Noir, we're going to talk about it for just a brief moment. We're not talking about Burgundy, we're purely talking about, again, the genealogy of Bordelais grape varietals. So we're going to start with Pinot Noir, one of the most ancient grapes on the planet. And we're going to cross it with a grape that has been lost to history. Again, this happens all the time just because of record keeping, and also because some grapes just don't get used for winemaking. Some grapes just existed in the wild and were put into some sort of village, and then they got crossed, and then they went out of favor. They rot or something, frost, destroyed the entire harvest. So we have Pinot Noir with a grape varietal that we don't know about. We cross that to come up with something called Sauvignon. Sauvignon is a grape mainly found in the Jura. So opposite side of France, over on the Italian border, up in the Alps. Sauvignon is a kind of a high-acid white grape varietal that, again, it can be oxidative, it can be interesting, it has an aromatic note to it, but really it's again, a kind of a unique thing, kind of almost a niche grape varietal. And we're going to cross that with another grape that's been lost to history. So we cross these 2 grapes together, and we get something that we know of as Sauvignon Blanc. And again, we know this in Bordeaux because this is what great white Bordeauxs are based upon, unless it's Semillon. But we have Sauvignon Blanc here. So we have Pinot Noir that eventually gets us down to Sauvignon Blanc. And then we need to cross Sauvignon Blanc with, once again, our good friend Cabernet Franc. And we come up with now Cabernet Sauvignon, the grape varietal that everybody puts usually first and foremost on the list of what do you need in order to make quality Bordeaux? Cabernet Sauvignon. So again, you trace Cabernet Sauvignon all the way back up the family tree, and you get to Pinot Noir. You put 2 of them side by side, they're unmistakably different. There's no way to confuse a Cabernet Sauvignon with a Pinot Noir. No matter how much oak you put on Pinot Noir, no matter what you do to it, these 2 grape varietals are totally different. But you see how history, how genetics can change something and create something totally unique, just like all of us. Cabernet Sauvignon would not exist without Pinot Noir. We would not exist without our grandparents and all of their benefits and flaws and nuances. So some interesting things here to keep in mind. And again, this has not just been a point in time where something appears and it gets adopted. In 1770, Chateau Latour, very different wine than we experience today. But here are some of the grape varietals that were in play here. Certainly Carmenère was a big factor. Cabernet Franc, obviously, because it was the grape varietal that had been around for the longest and had the longest track record. But Alicante, which is a teinturier, Alicante Boucher, it's actually a red grape that has red juice inside, as opposed to all these other grapes which actually give you a clear juice. Amora and Tarny, which is actually it's a mutation of Pinot Noir that ripens 2 to 3 weeks earlier than Pinot Noir. You say Mesouté or Pinot de Bourgogne, so they knew that this came from Bourgogne. And Pinot Noir, was part of the mix at Chateau Latour in 1770. Things have changed a bit. And then you have Lucan or Noir de Pressac, which is Malbec. Again, All these grape varietals that appeared much, much earlier in history than Cabernet Sauvignon were really important once upon a time. In not just historical footnotes, but part of critical winemaking at one of the top chateaus. All right, so again, we see here, so take a mental snapshot of this. Haute-Brion, 1770. We're going to jump ahead to 1855 with Chateau Latour. Again, one of the top properties in all of Bordeaux still today. And we look at the percentage of grape varietals that are being used. Again, in the 1700s, Cabernet Sauvignon didn't exist. This is a very recent thing in grape varietal history. But you look in 1855, maybe about 55%, 60% Cabernet Sauvignon at Chateau Latour in 1855. You had a quarter Cabernet Franc, 25% Cabernet Franc, maybe 20% Malbec, 5% Merlot. I mean, you think about that blend today, that doesn't seem anything like what we would expect from, certainly not a first growth chateau, let alone any chateau. That just seems like a blend that's totally out there and different from what we would expect. And then you look at 2005, and you look at the percentage of Cabernet Sauvignon, it jumps up to 80%. Merlot, about 18, 19%, and a itty bitty little sliver of Petit Verdot here. Right down there, maybe 1-2% of all the grapes that are planted at Chateau Latour. So you go from zero Cabernet Sauvignon in 1700s at any property. Haute-Brion, moving back one, Haute-Brion, no Cabernet Sauvignon to be found in 1770, not a drop of it. But you get to 1855, and all of a sudden, it's creeping in. 80 years later, you see a grape varietal take over at least 55% of one of the top properties. And these are people that know what they're doing with wine. It's not somebody who's trying something new, trying to figure out how to make wine. This is a first growth, classified in 1855 as a first growth, as a top producer. They had 55% of what is an 80-year-old grape varietal, if not a little bit more. That's pretty bold. That's pretty amazing for a grape to come that far. And then to be totally dominant 300 years later is exceptional. So what we're going to do now is we are going to now put what we have learned in terms of terroir and what we have learned in terms of grape varietal, and we're going to put these into glasses for you. And we're going to taste these all together. We're going to taste through a couple of different wines. We're going to start with wine number 3, and this is going to be 2004 Chateau Figeac from Saint-Emilion. As we learned, Saint-Emilion, right bank, so that's going to be clay and limestone-based soils, and it's also going to be more Merlot-based. Merlot prefers what I like to call, it prefers to have its feet wet. Likes to just kind of dangle its feet in the pool, doesn't mind sticking its feet in the ocean, doesn't mind having its roots in some moist soil. So what it does enjoy is clay. You pick up some clay, you go out into your garden and you pick up a handful of clay. Even on the hottest day, it still feels cool. And that's because water absorbs the heat out of your body a lot faster than, say, a piece of gravel that's at the same temperature. Gravel will actually not absorb the temperature from your hand. It'll feel warmer. And if it rains, if it cools everything down, that gravel will retain heat and it'll help to dry itself off, so it'll cause the water to evaporate, whereas clay will just retain that water and keep the feet of the vine, keep the roots of the vine a little bit more moist. So on the right bank, you're going to see a little bit more moistness in the soil, which is why we're going to see grape varietals like Merlot and Cabernet Franc taking the dominant lead here. So I want you all to taste, I'm going to lay all these grapes out for you, taste as you go along. Chateau Nenin, 2008, Pomerol. So again, we move to a slightly different terroir, much more clay-driven soils here. Certainly there's some limestone, but now we're talking about 88% Merlot. So when you go back to your glass of Cabernet and Merlot juice, the unfermented, unadulterated grape juice, think about, again, what does Merlot taste like? What does Cabernet taste like? Can you really start to pick it up here? And again, this is trying to parse apart, is it grape varietal, is it terroir, is it winemaking? It gets really complicated. You have a lot of variables, you have a lot of different iterations, almost infinite number that you can do with grape varietals, terroir, and winemaking. So here we have mainly Merlot with a little bit of Cabernet Franc. So you should expect a little bit more plushness on the palate, a little bit more roundness and plumpness, but certainly an herbaceous kick with that Cabernet Franc, a little bit more of a structured tannin. Moving into 2008, Chateau Canet from Pauillac. Now we flip the switch here. Now we go over to the left bank. Now we go into much more gravelly soils. So again, Cabernet Sauvignon, a relative newcomer here, and the left bank is a little bit more new soil, new terroir. I mean, these gravel mounds have only been in place for about 20 to 25,000 years. So Cabernet Sauvignon, a new grape on new soil. Much better drainage here. Cabernet Sauvignon does not like a lot of humidity. It doesn't like having its feet wet. It prefers a rapidly draining soil, which is why on these gravel mounds, Cabernet does exceptionally well. You will see Merlot. There is not just these gravel mounds to deal with. There is some clay, there is some limestone. There are little pockets that Merlot thrives, absolutely. And truth be told, there's a lot of Merlot planted all over Bordeaux. It is the most widely planted grape varietal in the entire region. So it's hard to go to a property and see an exception, basically exclusive Cabernet Sauvignon. And then you see Cabernet Franc and Petit Verdot blended in again, almost like a chef would use salt and pepper, almost like you would just throw in a dash of seasoning to give it a little bit of flavor, a little bit of texture, a little bit, just a squeeze of lemon over a piece of fish, just to give it something extra that rounds things out, rounds the experience out. And that's what Cabernet and Petit Verdot do here. And our fourth wine that we're going to be tasting together is going to be 2002 Chateau Latour from Saint-Julien. Now we turn the dial up almost about as loud as it's going to get for Cabernet Sauvignon. You will see a couple properties that go a little bit higher than this, but 82% Cabernet. So when you taste the Ducru Beaucaillou, go back and taste the Chateau Nanan. Think about what Cabernet and Merlot do on their own, and think about, are you really being able to pick up the difference between more red fruit flavors and more black fruit flavors? And don't worry, a lot of you are kind of scratching your head and saying, well, what am I supposed to be tasting? I have a slide coming up that'll kind of walk you through kind of the varietals, and you basically use this as a bit of a template, in a couple of slides as to what you're tasting. So any questions right now? Excellent. So again, just to kind of highlight some importance and some kind of keynotes here, and I'll go back to those grape varietals as well. Again, the movement towards Cabernet Sauvignon really ushered in by Phylloxera and then the frost in 1956. So we've moved away from Cabernet Franc, we've moved away from Carmenère, we've moved away from Malbec, even pushed a little bit away from Merlot. And Cabernet Sauvignon has really taken over here. Cabernet Franc, cooler areas, late flower, early ripener. So when you have a short growing season, Cabernet Franc does really, really well. Merlot needs a little bit more time on both ends. Cabernet Sauvignon, a little bit more time than that. Petit Verdot, even more time than that. So which is why you see you need to have nice long growing seasons, especially without water, without frost. So no rain during harvest time, no frost at the beginning of the season. So that way you can get bigger, fuller grape varietals like Cabernet and Petit Verdot to ripen to their potential. Again, Merlot doesn't like having its feet wet, doesn't mind having its feet wet. Cabernet Sauvignon prefers rocky, well-drained soils. It really, really likes that radiation of heat back up at the end of the day, so it can keep ripening. Even when it gets dark out, still picking up a little bit more warmth, getting a little bit more texture, a little bit more ripeness out of the fruit. So it is the later ripening of the three that we did talk about. So before we really dig into these wines, I do want to talk about a very controversial topic, and that is, can we taste terroir? Some people absolutely say terroir is something we absolutely taste. You can taste the rocks, you can taste the soil, you can taste the dirt. Other people say, well, there's no physical way for the vine to transmit a piece of a rock or a piece of dirt through its roots up into its stem and out to the grape. It's impossible. It just isn't able to happen. So it's really, can you taste minerality? And it comes down to a personal answer. And I think the more you taste wine, the more you start to perceive things that you can interpret as terroir. Certainly acidity, for me, often can give me a terroir kind of driven flavor and texture. Certainly limestone. It's not like going out when you were a kid and clapping chalk erasers, and I'm going to date myself a little bit by saying this, but you go out, you clap these erasers to clean them off, and you get this fine particulate dust in the air that you get in your mouth, and it's like, you taste the chalk. Can you really taste the chalk in the wine? For me, there's this combination of acidity and tartaric acid and texture that leads me to think, that I'm tasting chalk dust there. And it usually comes from regions where there's chalk in the soil. So again, it's a very personal thing. You might find terroir easier to pick up than other people. But don't worry if you do or you don't tonight, because it's something that you can really improve upon. And the more you pay attention to wine, the more you drink the wine, the more you experience the wine, you'll start to develop your own perception of terroir. So I think it's subjective. I do think it's a function of all three of these: ripeness, alcohol, and acidity. The more ripeness you get, I think it's harder to see more subtle differences in acidity, in differences in just how the wine is balanced. So again, I'm encouraging you all to taste more. Isn't that a great thing? So again, comes with practice: drink more, taste more, be mindful when you do. As I promised, here are your grape variety profiles. Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot up at the top, and then Cabernet Franc down at the bottom left. And then when you have wines with age and wines with oak, those can impart other flavors as well. People, they want to talk about vanilla and baking spices and clove and what grape varietal. That's a totally winemaker-driven flavor. Those are from the charring of oak barrels. You get things like vanillins and lactones. It certainly is a pleasant flavor. We all like these things, which is why a lot of people, when they start enjoying wine, gravitate towards oak. But when it's well integrated with all of these things, when it's well integrated, then you get hints of baking spices, hints of vanilla. As wine ages, you start to lose the primary fruit characteristics that we'll see up top, and they start to dry out. They start to become more savory elements. Think about the difference between a fresh raspberry or fresh blackberry versus dried raspberries, dried black cherries, dried plums. The flavors, there are some similarities, but the experience is very different. So you can see how age and oak will affect these. And as a little fun thing, I do have 3 wines for you at the end. 3 wines, and they're in glasses behind, and I'm not going to tell you what they are, because what I want you to do for 7, 8, and 9 is go through with your table, and we're going to have a competition here. What the prize is going to be determined later on, but we want you and your table to come up with what grape varietal is dominant, and what side of the river is it from? Is it left bank? Is it Cabernet? Is it right bank? Is it Merlot? And if there's going to be a tiebreaker, because there always seems to be a tie, the tiebreaker is going to be what percentage is the major grape varietal. So if you think it's a Cabernet Sauvignon in glass number 7, please say that it is 75% Cabernet Sauvignon, and therefore it should be also from the left bank. If it's 88% Merlot, like the Chateau Latour, then say it's 88% Merlot from the right bank. If you want to be specific and use commune, fantastic. No extra credit for that. But for 7, 8, and 9, that's how we're going to play the game.